Fazia, who's the organizing director for Drum. Thesis Rising Up, who is going to be allotted 5 minutes for your opening statement. And if there's something you can't get in, I'm sure we'll get back to it when we do the questioning. So, Mayor Morial,
thank you very much. First of all, good afternoon, Chairman Raskins and members of the committee. I'm Mark Morial. I serve as the President and CEO of the National Urban League. We are headquartered in New York City, and we lead a network of 90 Urban League affiliates across the nation. Importantly, this is my 4th census. I previously served as mayor of New Orleans for 8 years, president of the United States Conference of Mayors, a member of the Louisiana State Legislature. In 2010, I served as chairman appointed by President Obama of the Census Advisory Council. Currently, the National Urban League leads the Black Census Roundtable. The Black Census Roundtable is a coalition or network of some 100 African American, Caribbean American, African immigrant, and Afro-Latino organizations that are focused on ensuring a complete and full count. Let me say this, never before in the 4 times that I've done the census, but city. What I want to do with the time that I have is help everyone focus as the undercount been. The undercount, for example, in 2010, the black in the United States, based on the Census Bureau's own post-2010 census demographic analysis, the net undercount for black people was 2.5%, and the net overcount for non-African Americans was 0.5%. Black males in their 20s, 30s, and 40s had exceptionally high net undercount rates and high omission rates. The net undercount rate for black males aged 18 to 49 was very high, 7.6%, based on the Census Bureau's own demographic information. The net omission rate for black male renters ages 30 to 49 was almost 20% of all black men in 2010. These figures should alarm each and every one, but most importantly, should focus the efforts of the state of New York, the city of New York, community-based organizations on where the emphasis in a get-out-the-count effort ought to be, where the emphasis in any investment in resources ought to be. Very importantly, in 2010, young black children ages 0 to 4 were undercounted at twice the rate as young non-black children. The omission rate for the black alone or in combination population in 2010 was 9.3%. Non-Hispanic white communities are very likely to be overcounted, meaning wealthier white communities receive more than their fair share of resources and representation. This information is the census's own information. Number 2, I want to offer this observation. There's a lot of talk about the form and the online initiative that the census will undertake this year. It is expected that people will have 4 options to participate in the census. Number 1, the online option. Number 2, a telephone option. Number 3, a traditional mail-in form option. And 4th, an enumerator option. But what does the Census Bureau's own research say about which of those options is going to be preferred by American citizens? The Census Bureau's own pre-2020 census testing says that some 40% of white Americans and 50% of Americans of color are going to wait until the enumerator comes to the door. That is why it is absolutely unacceptable. And this committee has to stand strong in saying to the census, you cannot reduce the number of enumerators by 40%. You cannot reduce the number of local offices by 50% and expect that there's not going to be an undercount. I'm asking this committee, based on my many years of experience with this, to take whatever steps are necessary to elevate this issue. If there are no enumerators, the Census Bureau's own information, I want to emphasize this, suggests that the online option is not going to increase the number of respondents or decrease the number of respondents who are going to wait for the enumerator. That all it will mean is that those that might historically choose to send in the form may choose to go online. This is a critical component, which is why a lot of the din and the noise would suggest that because of technology, quote unquote, we don't need as many enumerators. Because of technology, we don't need as many local offices as we've had in the past. Their own research suggests absolutely contrary is the case. We have to encourage our communities, and we have to do what we can to increase the response rates, whether it's online or to the mail form. How can we do this? Historically, the Census Bureau had local offices and placed additional forms in libraries, public schools, community centers, and local offices. I've not heard a commitment by the Census Bureau to make additional forms available to those people who may not get a form through the mail, or those people for whom the form may get lost or misplaced. Tremendous efforts must be made, and I would say that this committee and the Congress of the United States and the House of the United States can be...
Thank you, Mayor Morrell, for those excellent points, and I'm sure we'll pick up on them in the question. Ms. Byron, only come to you for funding.
Thank you, and thank you so much for holding this hearing. I wanted to just start with the statement of the value that we're looking for, which is that we need a fair and accurate representation and functional governance, and for that, we need an accessible, accurate, and confidential census. Everybody so far that has spoken has underlined this. The problem is that the current system is optimized for digital participation. And that means that people who are underconnected or unconnected face a challenge, and the bar is higher for those people to participate. The overwhelming public focus on the high-stakes citizenship question has taken priority in our national conversation, and as a result, we are behind in addressing safety and security and functionality concerns surrounding the digital transition. So just to underline what this means, in terms of the digital divide, what the stats look like is that whereas 72% of white people have internet at home, there are 35% of adults nationwide who do not have internet at home, and of those, 53% of Latinx people do not have internet at home, 43% of Black people do not have internet at home, 42% of rural people do not have internet at home, and 50% of those who are 65 and older. So that's a big problem. And what we saw in the Providence end-to-end test was that whereas among the general population, 70% of those who participated online. In the Latinx population, 20% participated online as compared to 80% who participated by other means. So that's a huge disparity. And we're likely to see this disparity have a huge impact in the question of access. It's a question of digital literacy and a feeling of safety and support when people do engage online. So in my opinion, it's not enough to tell people that we'll have hotspots or that they'll be able to find access. We actually have to think about the safety and security and trust of people who are choosing to engage digitally. And there's another question, which is what happens if online response rates are lower than expected, and as a result, the cost of paper and pencil canvassing operations or canvassing operations exceed the budget that's allocated. We have not heard to actually close that gap on paper forms and enumeration. I think there is a possibility, given that the Providence end-to-end test ran out of money, and therefore we're going into the count with some. Furthermore, as Mr. Salvo pointed out, what we're looking at is essentially a count that is end-to-end technological process that's going to use advanced statistical modeling. Into this census, we could be looking at a predictive decennial census that is fed with biased information, meaning that it prioritizes those who are digitally privileged, that is, those who are able to get online to fill it out. So again, we're asking, are CBOs, libraries, and community anchors prepared to offer safe, secure internet access as well as digital literacy? Those are real questions that impact what people are willing to do. And while hotspots and get out the count outreach apps are useful, could they also create a data trail that endangers targeted populations if data is not well managed by the folks that are handling that data, or, for example, third-party advertisers who gain access to it? As an answer to all of this, I want to say that public libraries are a huge resource that have not been fully mentioned today. We talked about digital infrastructure that they provide every day for the census. 99% of New York's hard-to-count communities are within 5 miles of a public library, and 76% of the hard-to-count communities are within 1 mile of a public library. Libraries count. What we need to do is think about libraries and CBOs as critical infrastructure, and as such, we need to resource them to create safety. Now, the Digital Equity Laboratory is issuing some guidelines and suggested recommendations for how to improve public safety at hotspots and public libraries. However, that will take planning and resourcing, and in order to make that happen, we need, number one, transparency from the census. Are they going to allow for add-ons for privacy protection, browser add-ons? We need to know that there's infrastructure support and that this infrastructure is protected. And finally, we need to know that Title 13 will be honored by all workers. And does Title 13 apply to, for example, library staff who are helping fill the survey out? These are all questions that we don't have answers to. And
we'll follow up on a number of those. Ms. Oya, come to you. 5 minutes.
I just want to reiterate that the census is the heart of democracy. For more than 2 centuries, it has been a constitutionally mandated federal program that requires full participation of all persons. This intent was clear. James Madison, one of the Constitution's framers, believed inhabitants, not citizens, number of inhabitants. And any manipulation of apolitical, scientific data for partisan politics can infringe not only on this constitutional mandate, but also the right in 2016 elections and redistricting, indeed, your very existence in Congress. And another area of the census. The census has a documented, checkered past with respect to violating the confidentiality of respondents' information and public trust. In 1943, the U.S. Treasury Secretary requested the names and whereabouts of Washington, D.C. residents of Japanese ancestry from the Census Bureau. The Bureau released the data, along with block-level data of neighborhoods more heavily populated people of Japanese ancestry. In 2002 and 2003, the Census Bureau divulged neighborhood data on Arab Americans to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, including detailed info on how many people of Arab background lived in certain zip codes. In Central American countries who are still recovering from natural disasters and facing civil distress, imposing the Muslim ban and separating children from families has led to great distrust by immigrant communities of the federal government and its intentions. This distrust has been further fueled with Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement making arrests at local courthouses, a respected venue where residents are trying to comply with state law. I do want to answer Congresswoman Maloney's questions about whether just simply enforcing or simply making it known the protections of Title 13 is enough. I do not think it is. And would love to address that further later. The subcommittee knows well the important role of community-based organizations doing grassroots organizing. These efforts have propelled monumental historical healthcare, respond to natural disasters, and participate in government research on health, transportation, and housing. I want to address Julie Menon's response as to the proposed $8 million for community-based outreach and pop-up centers and community-based centers. I respectfully would argue that that is woefully inadequate. The Fiscal Policy Institute did a report upon which they based $40 million for the state of New York for community outreach efforts. Half of that $40 million was to be for New York City. If you take half of that 20 million and not even half, 8 million, you're talking of upwards of 1 million and more undercounted, hard to count communities that won't be reached. And when you talk about pop-up centers and community-based centers, it is imperative that community-based organizations be compensated. You're talking about hours of mobilization, interpreters, education and training beforehand. If you take one day, an 8-hour day, just one day of community outreach as an assistance center, and you staff that with just 10 people, you're talking, if you're averaging a half hour for each 120 people in one day. And if you talk about a census that's going to be live for 8 weeks, and you talk about staffing a pop-up center at a community-based organization, at best you may be only able to reach 9,000 people in that 8 weeks at one center. And so, it's just not possible. And that money needs to be appropriately allocated.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Greetings on behalf of Latino Justice Project, a national civil rights institution in the Latinx community headquartered here in New York with offices in New York City, Long Island, New York, and Orlando, Florida. I thank you for the invitation to share our views on the upcoming decennial census and its effect on the Latinx community, the nation's largest racial and ethnic minority. For purposes of my testimony, I would like to outline 3 points on how the census will impact the United States and the Latino community, and the threat of another count. First, it will cause communities in which Latinos live in to lose federal funding in critical areas such as education, healthcare, and other social services. Second, it will dilute political power in the Latino community and may actually prevent non-English speaking Latino citizens from exercising their right to vote. Finally, it will reduce capital investments in the Latino community and may hinder emergency responders from adequately preparing to deal with natural disasters in the Latino community. Mr. Chairman, as you noted earlier, there are several hundred federal funded assistance programs that are dependent on government money and subsidies. But I'd like to highlight how those affect Latinos specifically. Currently, there are 13.9 between 2014 and the 2015 school year. Title I served more than 24 million children. Over 1/3 of those children were Latinos. $11.2 billion goes to special education grants, of which 1.3 million infants and toddlers of Latino origin receive assistance. $8.3 billion go towards Head Start programs. In 2015 to 2016, Latinos comprised over 37% of those children. Any undercount of the Latino population, even a small one, will result in an artificial low allocation of federal funding to the Latino community and the communities in. As it was stated earlier, an undercount of anyone would likely affect the amount of congressional representatives that's afforded to their community. But an undercount in the Latino population may also have an adverse consequence on the right to a Spanish ballot for the citizens with limited English proficiency, as census data is used to determine whether a minority citizen is entitled to voting language assistance under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Lastly, I'd to talk about reduction in capital investments and the destabilization of the Latino community. Private businesses depend on financial force in the economy. Latinos spent over $1.3 trillion in fiscal year 2015, and it's expected to reach over $1.7 trillion by 2020. Approximately 4.4 million Latino-owned businesses in the U.S. contribute more than $700 billion annually to the U.S. economy and depend on the census information to be accurate. I like to quote Alexander Hamilton. There can be no truer principle than this, that every individual of the community at large has an equal right to the protection of government. An undercount of any community will compromise this. And lastly, to echo what Mr. Morrow said earlier, and just to add one addition, the census is only about the money that our people pump into this country. We're talking about the money that the government allocates. We're talking about political power, buying power, and we're talking about respecting data so that way we can continue to prosper as a community and as a government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Favors. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Greetings, Chairman Raskin and members of the subcommittee. My name is Libby Daniel Favors, and I serve as the General Counsel for the Center for Law and Social Justice. I am a civil rights attorney with 15 years of experience. Advocating's mission is to provide quality advocacy and community legal services to New Yorkers of African descent and to the disenfranchised. This is why in 2017 we convened the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition for Census 2020, a Pan-African coalition designed to ensure that all New Yorkers of African descent are fully counted on the 2020 census. Despite political protestations to the contrary, accurate data, proportionate distribution of electoral power and fiscal resources regardless of community, zip code, or race. The inclusion of the citizenship question on the 2020 census threatens to negatively impact the nation's ability to reach that goal, and the resulting inaccuracy will unnecessarily lock some of our country's most vulnerable communities into a political and economic underclass. The negative impacts of a flawed census data set are myriad, and they are particularly troublesome for new response rates during the 2010 census. These populations, all of African descent, include African Americans, Caribbean Americans and Caribbean immigrants, African immigrants, and Afro-Latinx communities. Racial disparities in census enumeration are not new, however, and low census counts in Black communities are an outgrowth of continuing patterns of racial oppression that date back to the time when Africans were first enslaved on these shores. When government or community groups engage in census outreach or education, we essentially undermine our efforts before they begin. As noted, one of the earliest references to counting people of African descent in the American census was in the 3/5 clause of the United States Constitution. This early instance of racially manipulating the census count was for the consolidation of political power in the hands of white supremacist slave owners. They misused census data to protect and perpetuate the economic system of slavery, and in the 70 years that followed the passage of the 3/5 clause, additional racist laws like the Missouri Compromise, the annexation of in 1845 of Texas, which was intended to be an empire for slavery, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, also known as the Bloodhound Law, the law that allowed slavery to flourish in Utah and New Mexico, and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which ensured slavery could continue to thrive. Not a single one of these laws, which were designed to keep Black people enslaved, oppressed, and locked into the bottom of society, could have passed without the 3/5 clause decades-old manipulation of census data. To see how this plays out in modern life, I'd like you to consider two families. The first is the Jackson family and the Johnson family. The Jacksons are a family of African descent, and they come from a community that is traditionally undercounted on the census. This family's history of interaction with the government is one that has been scarred by government-sponsored racial discrimination. Asks for information, the end result is rarely one that benefits their Black family or community. In the 1600s and 1700s, a demand for government information might mean that family members were sold into slavery, sent to parts unknown, tortured, raped, or killed, in not necessarily that order. In the 1800s, a government demand for information might result in escaped enslaved family members being returned to brutal slave owners under the Fugitive Slave Act. And in the 1900s and 2000s, it might mean that ACS would show up at your door to take your family away from you. It might mean that banks were going to issue your formerly redline community fraudulent bank loans, assuming you got a loan at all. And these loans, which would be riddled with such toxic racist loan products that entire Black communities lost and continue to lose more than half of our collective wealth through the foreclosure crisis. As a result of this history, this Black family is justifiably reluctant to deal with the federal government and might fill out one census form, though they could qualify for 3 or 4. On the other hand, the Johnsons, who are white, have a history that is marked by racial privilege and the over-distribution of societal engagement and benefit opportunities. They have a positive history of civic engagement. This family knows that when the government asks for information, once they turn it over, good forcibly removed Native Americans and opened up those lands to white families like the Johnsons. It means they became landowners and homeowners nearly overnight, practically free of charge. When their grandfather came home from the war, he was able to participate in the GI Bill, unlike the grandfather of the Jackson family. He received preferential rates for student aid, loan, and this with education and housing benefits that were racially distributed to whites, and often whites only. So when this white family is asked to turn over information on this census, they have a history that encourages them to do so. And in the end, they may have 3 or 4 census forms submitted, and they will live in a community that is going to receive more than their fair share of resources and political representation. All of which means that when it comes to the Black community organizations and faith-based groups must be funded for census work so that they, the trusted voices, can continue to educate and empower the community. Members of Congress and this community must exercise any and all oversight powers to reduce that participation. Funding for the census, which remains woefully underfunded, must be met in a way that is going to ensure that pop-up centers, complete count community associations, block associations, community boards, school districts, and other areas of civic engagement are going to have the funding that they need in order to do the work that is required.
Thank you very much, Ms. Favors, and Ms. Dia will come to you.
19 years old civil rights organization, nearly 4,000 low-income South Asian in Caribbean fighting for our rights, immigrants, and youth. Worker and communities of color. Our member are low-income people, cab driver, street vendor, restaurant worker, retail worker, domestic worker, and their children who made this city run. The 2020 census, the question that is asked and the method in which it is rolled out will have immense impact on us, only for our communities, but also for our city, our state, and fundamentally our society and our democracy. Before I go through the details of my testimony, I want to highlight our current context. We have an administration that has openly expressed anti-immigrant views. High-ranking members of the administration have expressed to have links to force that want to get rid of all marginalized immigrants from our country. All of this evidence in statements from the administration, as well as aggressive policies being implemented every day. The impacts of this statement and policies are very real. Over the last 9 months, we have engaged over 5,000 people in person about the 2020 census. The citizenship question, the safety and use of personal data, misuse personal data, and the impacts on funding and representation. We have held public education workshops in public square and at community events. And I want you to know that the fear is very, very high, not only among those that are immigrants, but also among those who are citizens. Citizens are worried whether their non-citizens family member will be at risk, but they are also worried their data will be misused to target their communities. This fear not unfounded. We already know about turning over the data related to Japanese interments in the aftermath of World War II, but those references presume that was last time data was misused and that are now protection in place. But in aftermath 9/11 census data about our communities down to the J force was also turned over US Customs Service to 2002 and the CBP 2003. We need to critically step taking ensure the data of individual or aggregate will be secured, which also include the elimination of questions related to the citizenship or immigration on the census. That step will be taken ensure protection of data. But a step will be taken to communicate and then security will consult the communities. We have years of outreach experience in this case on the previous census. We need to on the ground people with the experts in our communities to be able to effectively address questions and concerns that so many people have. This cannot be done by just printing ads on the media or making announcements. People need to be engaged, and that requires familiarity, expertise, time, and all of the requires funding and resource. If we do not commit to resource, it will lead severe undercounting with material and political impacts. We know that used to determine funding for almost all of our basic needs, from basic infrastructure, public benefits, to school, education, to transit, to hospital, to health. All parts of Queens has most overcrowded school in the city and in the country. Almas Hospital and Jamaica Hospital are also among us most overcrowded and under-resourced in the city. This impact, undercounting, cannot be understood, and consequences will be borne by our society as a whole. We have seen how measles outbreak did not just impact people who choose not to vaccinate their children. We live in the communities, impact one of us, impact all of us. New York State Eastern lost 1 or 2 congressional seats as a result of undercounting. That means that this is an issue of democracy. The quotient-related citizenship and immigration and the lack of resources of substantive outreach effort directly undermine our democracy. I wish I had more time to share our experiences and the content of our conversation with community members with you, but I want to know that this is issue critical and how we are prepared our implement Census 2020 will have long-lasting impact on our communities, our society, and our democracy.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fazia, for your excellent testimony. I'm moving into the statement as well from the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. And without objection, those will be entered into the record. We will give each of the members 5 minutes before we close. Ms. Maloney.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to say an important part of the census is hiring good people to get the count. So we need to get our neighborhood people hired, and they are having job openings now. And I'm sponsoring with Community Board 8 with other community leaders 2 jobs fairs. One is next week, June 8th, at the Stanley Isaac Neighborhood Center on 93rd Street and the river, where people can come fill out forms. The Census Board will be there. Encourage everyone to come. The jobs are very good jobs. They start at $25 an hour and go up to managing offices. And on June 11th, here in Queens, we're having a Queensbridge Jobs Fair from 3 to 8 to make people aware of all these jobs. I want to really reference our county leader, Greg Meeks, who pointed out that we have finally found one issue that Republicans and Democrats are united on, and that is getting an accurate count. And it is one of these issues that pulls us all together, all of our 160 countries that are here in Queens, the 96 languages. I'd say the imams, the priests, the rabbis, the ministers, they're all united, even the cab drivers and their riders. Rarely in government do we have something that we all agree on, that we know needs to be done, and that we are united on. So let's take advantage of having this positive program to work on. I'd like to ask the mayor how he was able to use proper counts of people in New Orleans to bring services that they need in education and healthcare, and how did you use the data to really measure the progress that you had in New Orleans and measure what needed to be focused on and areas that you needed to work on. And in case I'm cut off, because I know you're going to have a lot to say about the positive things that means getting the accurate count, I wanted to respond to Mrs. Yang and ask her and Mr. Velasquez and Ms. Favors and others how you respond to this incredibly high level of fear in New York. I will confess, for the first time in my entire life, I have not been successful in keeping families together. I had 2 families. I went all the way up to the top of government, and they deported the father of 5 children, the father of 3 children, married to an American. Their children were American, yet they were deported. So there is a lot of fear of mistreatment in the counting process and in status. And even though it is the law that you're going to protect this information, how do you overcome really the challenge that people live under, the fear actually they live under in New York, like I have never seen before, to boost economic opportunities for neighborhoods that need more help?
So thank you very much for a great question. And I think The testimony earlier was that there were 132 federal programs whose formula of funding was based on information in the census. And that rolled up to some $670 billion, which is a substantial portion of the overall domestic budget of the United States. I think for community-based leaders who might be here at the hearing or listening, if you think of the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is one of the most crucial dynamics of rebuilding urban communities, the allocations in that program are based entirely on the census information. If you think about the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act program, which is a fundamental job training program, and I could continue to go on. I think what people in the community know, a difference of just a few percentages can mean millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars for a city like New York, or for boroughs like Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx. That an undercount can impact the ability of community leaders to do the work that they have to do with public dollars. And so it is crucial. Now here's what's also important. A miss on the census affects you the entire decade. It's not like you get a redo the following year. It affects the entire decade unless there's some adjustments along the way. So I really hope people will understand on the research side, the decennial census and the American Community Survey are foundational, for example, to the report we issue every year at the National Urban League, which is the State of Black America report, which is referenced in congressional testimony, which is used by resources, which is a baseline report. So those are just some examples. I want to say that we have work to do to educate people that the census matters in their day-to-day lives. And I think that is the unifying message. It matters. It matters to money. It matters to power while we work on all of the things that are necessary to ensure complete count. That's great.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. Thank you all so much again for coming to testify. Ms. Facia, your work in organizing with DRUM is particularly critical in our community in New York 14, in Jackson Heights, in Parkchester, in so many different areas of the city. And I'm interested in learning and hearing from your insight in what types of messaging and what types of organizing techniques do you think would be most effective to get our communities filling out the census? We've heard so much about all of the deterring aspects, and I'm interested in hearing from an organizer and a leader in the community, what are some of the most effective messages that we can give?
I'm part of the Little Big Campaign 2010 census, just door knocking stuff with drama stuff. That time I was on November and I'm also undocumented that time. And I saw how much fear people have when we knock their door that time. And as an undocumented person also, I have also fear. So now situation changed. I'm the part of organizing, and also we held a couple of community events. We show people like a hospital, park, all resources, visually showing the community plaza and event and talk with our safety. We serve 60% undocumented population from South Asian low-income communities. People have fear, and fear is real. And in my experience, that's something of power. There is a something of power. Your information will be protected. Your physical hard copy will be destroyed after 3 months from mayor office, so and so. Then we give them hope for the safety, and this I know. They go to library and pop-up center, get their ID. But where is that kind of protections in census? I just heard today about 13, 13. As an organizer, if I heard today about 13, community don't know. We need solid something, then we can say people don't do it.
Thank you, Ms.
Facia.
Yeah, and even just from an organizing perspective, and all of us, whenever we're up for re-election, we need to count who is going to show up, cast a ballot on election day. And I remember walking oftentimes in Corona, in Jackson Heights, knocking on doors, and the fear that was so palpable because we understand that for so many of our families, you are one door knock away from your life being completely upended. And so to that end, Ms. Udianin, if the citizenship question does appear on the census, what are some of the most effective techniques that we can implement in protecting the identities and protecting the information, the confidentiality of the information on all of the return questions?
First of all, I applaud Congresswoman Maloney and her leadership in introducing the Census Idea Act. I think particularly this committee focused on civil rights and civil protections must aggressively pursue the passage and immediately of the Census Idea Act, which mandates a 3-year review for each question proposed to the decennial census, and that would effectively deal with the citizenship question, which was not vetted and should be excluded from the census. Secondly, I do feel it's an issue of will here. If what is primary and what constitutionally is mandated for an accurate and complete count, then no person should have to decide between getting basic benefits and fearing the complete uprooting that you're talking about. And the government must send that message. We saw at the city, Congressman Neka, City Councilwoman Neka, leadership, the protections that Fozia talked about. We saw with the Immigration Act of 1986 and amnesty. Do you remember that? I lived through that. I helped many people get legalization. There were protections in place that allowed people to come forward that didn't go after their employers, because remember, you had to show that you could support yourself if you came before 1982 and remained consistently. Well, our laws doesn't allow you to work. How do you do that? And so people had to come forward with records, had to divulge things, and the government had the right spirit and did not go after employers or others who hired people off the books and things like that. If the true intent is to get a complete count in which this whole country is dependent on accurate data, then the government must send the message. And so I would propose that the government must make it very clear that any person who is undocumented, who is required to complete the census, will not be deported. There will be amnesty. It doesn't mean a legal status. It just means not being deported. If they can show that they completed the census and so forth and so on, that they will not be deported. And it's that protection that Fozia is talking about. It's not enough, given all that's happened, to say, oh, we got Title 13, and there's a penalty for anybody who discloses, you know what I mean? Because there is 1,002 different ways to get around that penalty, you know what I mean? If the government wants that information. So the government must make it unequivocally clear that no one will be deported.
All right, thank you very much for that powerful closing statement. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for their sensational testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for any of the witnesses to the chair, and we will forward it to you for a response. And I would just ask you to return with any statements you have as quickly as you're able to do so. Again, I want to thank all of you for participating. I want to thank our terrific audience here and our friends at LaGuardia Community College and the members who participated. Thank you.